Welcome to the Independence by Design podcast, where we discuss what it means to be a business owner and ways to get unstuck from the day-to-day so we can design a business that gives us a life of independence. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. I know you're going to love this conversation that I had with Brandon Henry. He's a dear friend of mine. I met him about 8 years ago. He is a co-founder of a firm called Mosaic Advisors, which is a family office for over 30 families of the ultra high net worth individuals. He manages billions of dollars in assets. And there's a couple reasons I wanted you to listen into a conversation I had with Brandon. One is that I cannot tell you how much I respect his intellect and his experience of really managing the complexities of a family business and all the things that go into it. Obviously, some of the most wealthy individuals in the country trust him. So there's a lot to be learned there. But also, I think as owner operators, I mean, I've always wondered, like, what are the most wealthy people doing? How did they get there? How do they manage their business? How do they think about their business? How can we reverse engineer what they did to set ourselves up for the highest probability of success? And that's exactly what Brandon's going to be doing, is sharing the mindset. I mean, it's just a conversation between Brandon and I, talking about a lot of the same topics you hear me talk about, but hearing it through the context of someone that's working with people that have $200 million net incomes. And I think you're going to enjoy the fact that not everybody's got it figured out. And we're all dealing with the same things. And if we're building the foundation of an ownership structure so you can create cash flow and equity and have that mindset, you're laying the groundwork to be able to accelerate your success over a long period of time. So if you want to know what some of the most successful business owners are doing in the country, tune into this conversation with Brandon and I. Thanks so much, everybody. And I hope you enjoy it. It's the constraints of like helping us. I think understanding the constraints helps people think through their actual reality. So like, and it's all about alignment of expectations too. Cause like, I mean, everybody wants, like, you worded it very similar, Brandon, how I like to, like, I like to say we eat glass, or I think people are willing to do hard things if they know how it's going to get them to their outcome, but they are spread so thin because they're not sure how to swim through all the decisions.
Yeah, no, the decision fatigue is a real deal. And if you're a successful entrepreneur, to a certain degree, you have to be a Jack Russell Terrier, right? You have to be able to prosecute 50 different things at once. And in order to really move the needle on the most important things, you have to be willing and able to focus. You need the same rigor and effort around these things as you have around growing the business in the first place. And people often romanticize what it means to be an entrepreneur, but the first couple of years, the first decade was hard. It was really, really hard. And people are very hesitant to go back and exhibit that same type of effort when trying to do something brand new. And brand new oftentimes is getting focused on their priorities.
So let's let me do this. Let me walk you through just I think there's a lot of good ground we can cover from your experience, who you're dealing with, and then going kind of giving you an idea of where my clients are coming at and the people that are listening in. Because since you and I met in 2016, I mean, like, and I'll put the podcast that you and I did in the past link in the show notes, but like, I just want to say a couple of things before kind of teeing up and putting a container around the big problem and what I think you can help with is that, dude, I remember, I have to tell you, like when we were sitting at that dinner, in exit planning, and I hate those words. I don't even know if people know what that means, but you and I were sitting there talking about it in our certification, and you had walked through some partnership buyout entity structure. And I was like, I have no idea what the F he's talking about, but I can guarantee you if I knew that, I'd be more valuable. So like, yeah, you set the domino, man, in the order, because like, I was just like, I don't know. I got to know what the hell Brandon's talking about.
Well, if that conversation helped you put you on this trajectory even a little bit, the world's better for it. So I'm happy.
I appreciate that. And you were eating your almond butter because of your keto diet. And so, but okay. So with your clients, and you and I in the last one talked about ownership thinking, being in the boardroom and that kind of stuff. And with your clients, with your 30-ish, families, managing their wealth is way different than all the other people who are doing assets under management. And I always say, like, there are very few family offices who even do that. I mean, everybody puts the effing, crap out there of like, where do family offices? And it's like, oh, AUM and insurance sales, or like whatever it is, and I say this because you're doing it because you've got the boutique for these specific families that you're managing their entire estate and their planning and all that stuff. And my clients aspire to get to even understand what that looks like. And I think one of my jobs out there is to help people understand what could be. And so that back to our, trade-off and constraints is like, what am I building? And do I want to build that? What does that take? And so the better understanding of what could be, they can have a better understanding of what they want to strive for. And so the clients that I'm working with, the people that are listening in, with the new ownership framework, it's this ability to see the company as the means of getting more to what they want, but understanding how it impacts their time, cash flow, wealth, because they've got a job and they got an asset. And so I'd say like one of the biggest components and why I don't like the word exit is because some people just want to step back. And Brandon, one of the things that I've said, because of my last experience for the last 5 years, 6 years in the financial modeling world, if people can build a three-statement model into the future, they can see their income through distributions while someone else runs their company. And then like this whole like zeros and ones from the matrix come up. But it's like this private equity meets family office mindset for people who are used to just doing their job. And it's like a $30 million company or whatever it is. And thinking this way is just different than more L10s and EOS and freaking org charts. So like they got to do both, but like, does that kind of help put the container around it?
It does. So, you know me long enough to know that once you wind me up, I don't stop. So
I know. Hopefully, I was like you were just like winding up while I was doing that.
Yeah, feel free to put some brakes and gas pedal in here. Maybe we'll start with the end in mind and we'll work backwards.
Yeah, let's do it.
I had a really informative conversation with a group today that I think will be useful for our dialogue, and it's universal. It doesn't matter what size the company is. So there are broadly two things that every family and family business is wrestling with. There's financial capital and there's family capital. And these are gross oversimplifications, but I'm going to try and weave some of the frameworks that I think really successful families bump up against and where they often stub their toe. So in the financial capital, it's the tax, legal, financial, business, investment, and philanthropic structures, the hard parts of a client's life that helps them to grow, protect, and transfer their wealth. It's tax planning and estate planning, and do I use an LLC versus a corporation, and am I filing a 1065 or an 1120? And it's when I give assets to charity, am I giving stock or am I giving cash or giving real estate? It's the technical stuff, and it's the things that families can most easily outsource to professionals, whether it's one person or a group of individuals.
Would you call that like the family office? Like it's the wealth, technical, estate, family office, which is not the operating entity. Because like if like the reason I go back to private equity family office thinking is like a family office invests in a PE firm, but they put managers in there to get the rate of return, right? But like so we're kind of bifurcating.
Yeah, well, I think we're disaggregating the way that we allocate capital within the operating business, the way that we allocate resources across the family. Sometimes I talk about it from like the stock certificate out of the actual family operating business. And then the parallel to that is the family capital, which is these are the quote unquote soft issues, ironically enough, much harder to deal with. These are the agreements and the frameworks and the ways that we make decisions together so that people can understand opportunities, responsibilities that come with significant success, right? So it's all the soft stuff that the family and the family office has to deal with. And these aren't attorneys and accountants. These are typically industrial psychologists and people that are really talking about family dynamics. And I joke, right? One area is the conference room table and the other is the dining room table. And so financial capital is the conference room table, and then family capital is the dining room table.
And it's helpful because and this is where it'll be insightful to hear how you're managing this with your clients, because when I talk about like the game of ownership, which is one of the components of my material, is like private equity versus ESOPs versus VC versus public. At the end of the day, it's all capitalism, right? So it's cash flow and equity based on the timeline. And so whether people know it or not, they're playing that game. And so by clarifying their goals of distributions and equity within that timeline, we can then better figure out how they're going to fund it, like from the entity level, not the family level, but this is where they're both together. Because if someone wants to have just the distributions and it's a dividend stock, like Warren Buffett talks about, versus a growth stock, that'll impact your cash flow, but that has to be driven by the family, not the operations. And I think so many times people get it all commingled together.
Well, and so double clicking on that, and that's where the conversation this morning came up. So this is a family office here in town, kind of a blue chip family, and they've got now a private equity arm that's fairly well known. And what they really pride themselves on is minority investments in kind of $5 to $15 million EBITDA businesses. They're kind of writing checks in the $10 to $30 million range, and it's a combination of debt and equity. And when they were talking about how these minority recaps allow the family business to still own and control the business. And I pushed back on a little bit. I said, well, tell me what control actually means here. Because in many cases, this family business has got significant debt for the first time. So we've got covenants that ultimately dictate how the business is run. I said, yes. And I said, probably got a real board for the first time. And so now they've got decision makers and a responsibility to provide information that they never had before. They say, yes. And I said, we're no longer running assets through the business, expenses through the business, because it might optimize taxes, right? Because now we have other shareholders on the cap table. A client literally this morning talking about putting a couple $100,000 of heavy equipment through the company because it will be meat at the ranch. So can't do that any longer. I said, so that doesn't feel like control at all. Maybe they have operational control day to day, but they don't have control of business. And I said, but also you invest through a fund, right? I said, yeah. I said, so if you buy my company in year 3 of a 10-year fund, what happens 6 or 7 years from now? They said, well, we sell the business. So I have no control now whatsoever about that outcome. And their pushback to me, which I think is totally appropriate, is what we're doing is we're professionalizing ownership. And we're helping people become good owners. We're helping people get really clear about what it means to be an owner. And do we want a company that generates free cash, or that we're reinvesting every nickel back into the business? And we have to have the Still Orion life, predictable, transferable, the cash flows that we have visibility into, that we have confidence that they're there and that we can transfer to somebody else. And that makes a good business. It doesn't matter if we're going to sell to an ESOP or I'm going to transfer to my children. I've heard people on your podcast and others say, hey, listen, if it's a business that can be transferred, it's also a business that you want to own. And that is universally the case. And so when people talk about this private equity model, really all we're talking about is professionalizing ownership. We're not talking about generating more absolute wealth, right? Because the private equity firm wants to own it because it's going to go up in value a ton. Well, that's the same reason you might want to hold it.
Well, and this is why I love it. Yeah, I love it. And well, this is where I think it's, and I've been stuck on this, Brandon, because you and I met in the exit planning certification, and I think the dysfunction that those words have brought to the marketplace have been so destructive, because it makes it feel like there is one thing that disappears or it stays. We're like, what are you talking about? Your job or the asset? I can't even answer that anymore. I want out. I literally, every one of my workshops, won't answer that question anymore, because it's a false choice. And whether it's professionalizing the investment or private equity mentality or family office mentality, at the end of the day, ownership thinking is about ownership over assets, and we want cash flow based on the risk of that equity growth. And that's it, right? And the company that is generally people's job, that started off as someone's job and is all commingled and all this stuff, is the vehicle that got them there. But that's what it is. And most people haven't seen that. And so I go back to the red pill experience. Once people understand this material, it's then the choices become different.
Yeah, if a big reason that a craftsperson, at least the families that we serve, went out on their own to pursue something they either enjoy or are good at, was because they didn't fit into the broader organization. They didn't want to be told what to do. And the apex manifestation of control is having options. And if I choose to work my tail off in the business because it's the thing I enjoy, wonderful. And if I choose to hit the eject button and own and cash flow the business, great. If I choose to be able to give it to my kids or my management team on a moment's notice without missing a beat, fabulous. And at any point in time, I can turn around and flip this to a third party and receive a fair value for the risk of that business and cash flow of that business. Fantastic. That's the maximum optionality that any family should aspire to. But that's also the same optionality you want for any investment. Right? If I'm going to invest in a stock or a private investment, and my stock portfolio is liquid and I can punch out at any time, my private investment means I'm going to hold on for another decade with having no transparency, no liquidity, K1s, late tax returns. I expect to earn more as a consequence of that extra complexity and those other headwinds. Right? The way that you increase value and the way that you increase um, uh, time with the family, and is by preserving as many of those options as possible. And that's all it comes down to when it comes to being a good owner, right? And the distinction is simple versus easy. Right? 60% of the United States is overweight, not that they don't know to eat less and move more, just it's hard to do. Right? Even though the idea, the fundamental pieces of that are simple to understand.
Well, and I think going back to the goals is like, you and I can't remember if we were on the recording or not, but like doing the, eating the glass. If I know, like, I mean, if I know I'm going to be more independent by doing these things because I've created more time and cash flow and wealth, then I'll do it. But if I can't see that path, I'm going to default to habits. And so what I want to talk about is like, what are the habits, or what, like, where on the spectrum of your clients, right? Because like, I think a lot of my clients, and it's difficult for people to understand where each other are at. And I say this because, I've been almost 2,000 people in Vistage that have seen my material. And like, dude, there's people that are the size of companies that you would work with in there. And like, and I'm still going, holy shit, you don't have a 3-statement model forecasting the future. You're just making shit up. It's totally effing crazy to me. And so it's like, and then you have other people that are going like, they're so hard on themselves because they're not in a place where they should be. And so what I want to do with this conversation is kind of level set reality of like, okay, what is ideal? What we want to strive towards ideal. We don't want to have perfect be the enemy of good. So like, kind of getting up here into like the spectrum of like where people are at, how did they get there? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's say the quiet part out loud. Um, most super successful closely held family businesses are not nearly as sophisticated as people perceive them to be. Most super successful.
You put that way more
families,
elegant than I thought you were gonna. I laughed already because I thought
I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna build up ahead of Steve.
They're making shit up.
Yeah, they're making shit up. I mean, most family offices. So let's talk about a family office because there's this patina around a family office that I think is totally unjustified. And I appreciate the world that I operate in. I'll quantify it because it's certainly not the whole spectrum of wealth. So for us, it's first generation founders. These folks are in Texas, and they're kind of $100 million of total net worth to maybe 3 or 4 billion. And these guys are still operating their business, and by and large, these guys are down and dirty blue collar businesses. So these aren't hedge fund titans. These guys own businesses that make things. That's the core of our client base.
Own things to make things for real people with real money, with real cash flow, who buy real things.
You can touch and feel them, right? Their wealth is not created on Excel. And these guys, to a large degree, built a business because they were good at a thing, and they had an allergic reaction to somebody else telling them what they can do. And they all this universal set of goals, and they went out on their own, and they kind of fell backwards into this gigantic company. And so we talk about family office. There's a quote in the family office space that drives me crazy. If you've seen one family office, you one family office. What that means to say is families are unique and they've all got a different bent. And there's some truth to that. They're all trying to accomplish basically the same thing, right? Most family offices start off as embedded in an operating business. That simply means the CFO or the controller and the executive assistant is pulling double duty. They're doing their job and they're helping the patriarch or the principal of the family track down an investment in a piece of real estate.
Well, let's talk about why, because this is very interesting. This is so interesting, Brandon, because it ties in my experience since selling the family business, which was wealth management for 18 months, but then all the way onto the other side where my partner, Pat Hobby, was a CFO doing that. Like, so, and why is that? Is because like, if we're reinvesting back in the company, they have oversight over that. But if they take the money out to give distributions, they have to be responsible for continuing to run the operation. So like, it's the person that has view over both sides and is responsible one way or the other for how that money is getting allocated.
Yeah. So maybe we'll do a hard right turn and we'll come right back to it. So when you think about the entrepreneurial journey, right? So we oftentimes have families that talk about the way it used to be, and they wax poetically about how simple their life used to be. Nobody wants to go back to being broke and scrappy, but they all remember those times as having some positive influence. When you think about that entrepreneurial journey, they collect professional advisors like they collect baseball cards. They're based out of need. It's typically when something is blowing up. They do it not because they're fielding the very best team. They do it because they've got a guy. Everybody's got a guy, and they call up a buddy and say, "Hey, who's your trust and estate attorney?" And they give them a name. "Who's your banker?" And they give them a name. These aren't being like well-researched and well-reasoned, vetted for personalities and unique skill sets. They collect this team that doesn't talk to each other, They all have their own unique specialization. And in the beginning, the individual, the business owner, which is where certainly I am in my professional career, imagine a bunch of the people that work with you are, they're pinballing back and forth between all these professions. They're asking questions. Maybe they're qualified to do so. Maybe they're not. Certainly don't have the time. They're gathering the information. They're shuttling that information to another professional to do something about it. And they're racking up costs and they're racking up a huge bill in terms of time.
And heartburn and lack of time and all that stuff when they're running the business, trying to spend, I mean, back to independence over time. And there's, yeah.
That's right. And so the very first step is recognizing, hey, complexity and success are interlinked. And so I'm going to need an attorney that focuses on this, that, and the other thing. And I'm going to need a CPA that's got a little more chutzpah than, the accountant that I started with in the beginning who just does QuickBooks. And I'm going to need a banker that has the lending ability to make a $5 million loan, not a $100,000 loan. So I'm going to grow my complexity as my business grows, but I don't want to do it myself. And so the first person they tap on the shoulder is their chief finance person in order to do that. And the CFO, by and large, does not want to do it. Or if they want to do this, they don't want to do the other thing. They don't want to actually be responsible for the business. And so you've got this individual who's pulling double duty, and they're no more trained for this than the business owner is. It's just trying to provide some sort of operating leverage.
Let's just talk about how unique that is because, and by the way, I have a slide on my workshop where I literally have all of those heads of people that you talked about. And then there was my dad and then I always joke around. We'd say we would go through that whole experience, and then I would walk out of those meetings. I'm like, what the F are we supposed to do about that? I don't know. Go sell more shit, get more revenue. Hopefully, we'll have more cash, and hopefully, all of those headaches will go away. But from the CFO side, for crying out loud, dude, with how much exposure I had from hiring CFOs and turning them around and you're talking $250,000 and it's a 1 out of 10% chance or 1 out of 10. So 10% chance that they can do a 3-statement model forecasting. So you're going, okay, for, significant 6 figures, you can't even get someone to focus on the business doing the right shit because they're like a glorified controller. And so then it's okay, what is even the expectation of a CFO if you find the person, pay the person and get them focused on the business, let alone doing your banking, your legal, your insurance, your wealth. I mean, it's just asinine for the expectations.
Well, and the number of times, I think we talked this the last time we got together, I sat with a family, sat in a board meeting, the CFOs presented a balance sheet and an income statement. They couldn't spell statement of cash flows. The families never had it presented to them. But even if they did, they don't really understand. This isn't
what to do with it.
What to do with the balance sheet or income statement? What does this balance sheet actually mean to me?
How much we can get in lending, Brandon?
Yeah, how am I making? Well, you're right. I'm doing this thing because somebody else is asking for it. I'm not doing this thing because I'm actually using it as a business management tool. They don't have dashboards. They don't have statement of cash flows. They're not tracking real metrics because they don't have an ownership framework around what I'm actually trying to achieve. Am I stepping on the brakes and I'm just going to gin out a bunch of cash because that's where I'm at in my life cycle with my family? Stepping on the gas, I'm going to reinvest like crazy. Those things are second, third, fifth, 10th place on the list of things that they're paying attention to. And I'll just give you an idea.
Before hold that thought, but at the same time, what I have found, Brandon, is in their head, they already know because they're doing what they want to do, no matter what, which is why they're doing this, that they already know I'm going to seize that opportunity and I can't wait for this. So they're already planning and that money's already allocated and no one has been discussed with this, how it impacts distributions versus reinvestment versus all that mechanical shit. So they're going through the motions of going through all these meetings, yet in the back of their mind, they're they've already got a plan that no one has any visibility to.
Well, I'm gonna give you a real life story that happened today. Came right from that meeting to visit with you, and it's a large company. I'm gonna round down to say they'll do $200 million in net income this year. So huge amount of success. And we're talking about the structure of the organization. And we're talking about whether or not it should be a C corporation or it should be a pass-through. I mean, some of the most mind-numbing, boring things on the planet. Things that you would typically think your CFO is involved in. And this is a business where the family takes very little out of the company and they're basically reinvesting back in the company as much as they possibly can. And they're on bank credit facilities in a meaningful way, hundreds of millions of dollars of bank credit facilities. the flywheel is spinning so fast I can hear it from my office. And so we're talking about the structure. And I'm telling this individual, we built this big model based on all of his inputs and based on his CPA's recommendations. And based on estate tax savings, income tax savings over the next 15 years, it'll save his family $500 million tax savings, real money. And I'm at the end of the meeting, I'm like, don't you think we should have your CFO in here and he could help us make really informed decisions about this model and what those inputs are? And he goes, nah, he's busy with other things. And it was like this mind blowing experience. We're talking about things that fundamentally alter the way the business uses capital.
Where it comes from. Yeah.
And the CFO is not even part of the conversation because in his mind, the CFO is somebody who does things in the rearview mirror. Once we made $1
at a company that size too, which is wild.
200 million, yeah. The company's probably worth $1 billion. Yeah, it's staggering. And I tell that story not as a flex, but to say, but it doesn't matter if you're making $1 million of EBITDA, $50 million of EBITDA, $200 million of EBITDA. There are individuals who have not professionalized the organization by being really clear about what it means to be a good owner, all up and down the spectrum. And the same problems that the $1 million EBITDA guy has, reacting, not being proactive, not really setting the agenda, if you will, for himself and for the team and deciding what type of asset this business is for himself and for his family, is the exact same problems, simply amplified with a couple extra comments.
All right, so I got a question for you. Yeah, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. However, I'm fundamentally trying to change that situation by making it easier because okay, I want to know what you think about this because I've thought a lot about what you just said because I have gotten out of these workshops and I'm like, I don't know what the F, dude. Like how is this possible? So I've come to two conclusions. And so because I'd walk out going, okay. So because I've you need a 3-statement model to have the visibility over this shit to make decisions. You need to know what you want. You got to have a 3-statement model. You got to have the run, the trade-offs to run the situations, yet no one does. And I'm going, okay, how is this possible? So here's how I've wrapped my head around it. When I say how is it possible that this many people are out there without this stuff? Okay. So one is that in 2008, the money printer hit. I think capitalism was, cut out at the knees and everything went up and to the right. I mean, like with 0% interest rates, everyone was able to look at their income statement disproportionately. I'm not saying all the time, but I watched it with my dad and I. I mean, we were a distributor and it still went up and to the right with the cash conversion cycles a son of a bitch. And okay, so if everything goes up and to the right, you can sell a bunch of shit and cash still ends up in your checking account. People just don't know why. They're like, well, people woke up and bought our services and these are the services that they bought. And and we just have to keep being a good, there was a lot of ability to hide a lot of cash flow hides a lot of sins. And so there's that for 15 years before COVID and supply chain issues and inflation and all this stuff makes it where the balance or the cash flow statement becomes your best dashboard to manage these. So that's one factor. The second factor is, if there's market demand meets entrepreneurial grit, where you're just going to eat shit to make it work. And then the last thing is added with a good cash conversion cycle, said a different way for people, is a good business model where someone gives you customer deposits and you use other people's money. Where if you're doing big project, I had people that I took on as clients, Brand, and they had negative equity, but they didn't know it because they're always sitting with millions of dollars in their bank account from, reoccurring revenue or customer deposits. But there's no understanding of how all that happened. So I don't know, man, because I don't want to begrudge people that are successful for this, but my last podcast was called Intentional Growth. And I'm a lot of people aren't intentional. I mean, what do you think? And I'm trying to, I don't know, man.
Both of those seem like plausible accelerants. We saw a little bit in 2022, right? We had basically zombie companies for the better part of 15 years who have had no consequences to actually be fiscally responsible, generate free cash, watch their expenses, and manage a business in a competitive environment where there's an actual cost of capital and where competition isn't automatically stomped out. And in 2022, stock market puked. All of a sudden, a bunch of the names that had been out of favor, all of a sudden were in favor because they actually made money. And the companies that didn't make money, all of a sudden were in trouble. And of course, there was plenty of gyrations at the top, and more, money printer continued, and here we are, where those types of companies are still rocking and rolling. So that certainly makes sense. And there's plenty of those businesses, small and large, that don't have any fiscal discipline. That's part of it. But I think the real tell for me is, and you know this business better than I, the number of businesses that just won't trade hands. However many tens of thousands or millions of businesses are in the United States, a huge portion of them will try and sell at some point in the future, and they'll be denied. We're not going to entertain the process. What they have is a job. They don't have a business. And I think we have a naming convention issue. There are a lot of people with good jobs. There are very few people that have a business. A business, in my mind, is an asset.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, I think we've labeled these things the wrong deal. Most people are not entrepreneurs in the traditional sense, right? They just happen to work for themselves. And
it could be even 20 employees. Where
Yeah.
like, I mean, Brandon, I was working on the situation with one of my clients going through like an internal bank funding, and the spread between the multiple and the EBITDA and the enterprise value and the ability for that company to afford that debt for 10 years was like 40%. I'm just like, they can't even like, and then they can't retire. And I'm like, this is like, the whole thing is so screwed up.
I would just simply challenge the notion that size equals sophistication or professionalization. And it certainly doesn't equal an experience associated with like a forcing function to take those things seriously. There are a lot of folks talking about intentional growth. There are a lot of folks that have built this big business, not because they were deliberately trying to grow a big business and treat it like people stereotypically would consider a big business. They just, what do I do? Wake up in the morning, I work really hard, try and sell stuff or make stuff that people want to buy, and I go to bed.
And that's where the market demand and then meets entrepreneurial grit. That's what you just said. And then the business was able to get big enough. But like where I see so many people get stuck is in that cash flow where like, it's so easy to say, dude, just go hire a $250,000 CFO or CEO or what, like you need $1 million in SG&A of executives. And you're going, I'm finally making 300. Where's that going to come from? And then there's like, you have to double down again. So like, I don't know. Have you seen some of your are you getting to these clients by the time that they've already gotten over that and they're sitting at a huge cash flow heap where like that machine's just going?
Yeah. So we're definitely getting engaged on the backside of luck, right? And I don't mean it once again as a pejorative, but like the families that we're working with, they've already achieved escape velocity.
Luck in financial engineering sense, not like, because like doing what people have done is really hard, but it's not like 3-statement model, have all the professional advisors, that kind of stuff. Is that a fair statement?
So I think there's there are plenty of folks that are just as smart as some of the families that we serve, who work just as hard, that aren't in the same place. And so there's some other element there. And it's the willingness and ability to take extraordinary amounts of risk that they don't fully understand, and one or two things breaking their way that have helped them to reach escape velocity. But what I have seen, and I think this is true up and down the continuum of size, is when families finally get serious about running their business in a professional way, the good business becomes a great business. The good job becomes a very, very valuable asset. Treating the financial FP&A function within the business as not as a cost center to be loathed and the bean counters to try and purge, but instead leaning on that as a place to generate new ideas to run the business more efficiently. The idea that we're going to talk about ownership as our highest and best priority, like that ultimately is the top down if it sets that priority, that has yielded a huge impact where we've seen revenue and income grow substantially. We've seen equity value grow substantially, but more importantly, we've seen options grow substantially. For the family that had none, where the only chance they had was to give it to their children, literally, because there was nobody else they could buy it from, to now have a whole world of things available to them that they can contemplate, from a third-party sale to an ESOP to a intra-family transition to a management buyout to, hey, maybe it's just a really good company that generates lots of free cash and I don't show up every day, so I want to own it for the next 20 years. all of those things reveal themselves when they get really serious. And there's plenty of families with big businesses where they don't have any of those options.
Well, and isn't that why how do you feel about my disdain for the word exit? Because everything you just mentioned are wildly different situations depending on what they want to do with an asset. It's really just understanding what you want allows you then to understand what you want to do with your assets, right? I mean, is it anything more complicated than that?
No, it doesn't fit on a business card or on a brochure or in a designation, when you've got to use word salad to describe what it is. But I'm with you. I think there's some labeling issues around this idea that you have to sell your business and that's the only option that's available to you. And certainly for us, families go through this romantic notion, whether it's because it's forced upon them or because that's what they ultimately want, that they're going to transfer their company to their children, to their younger generation. And what I've seen time and time again is they get serious about running a really good company and they professionalize ownership and they professionalize the information sharing within the company and they professionalize record keeping and the financial reporting. They professionalize goal setting and dashboard. And all of a sudden, they don't have that same motivation or desire to sell the company because they love it.
Yeah,
not because they love their kids not because they love their kids any less, because they have options. It went from the only thing they could do to one of a whole host of things that they can do. And lots of times, Timmy isn't the best person to run that business.
So there's so many different threads I want to pull on that one. And maybe I can just plant a couple of seeds and you can help me juke and jive here. One is the family governance and how people go through that, like as they're going through the mindset of like, hey, this is an asset. It's not a job. I'm not the king of Egypt that needs to hand this down to my prince. And like, there's other options where we can have the company stay in the family estate while my kids do whatever they want. I mean, so that's one kind of concept I want to talk about. But before we get there, and maybe this, I think it's probably intertwined, but this idea of like one thing in Brandon I found is one of the biggest components behind this issue in this marketplace is how valuations work, which is like literally how an investment works, which is the risk of the future cash flows equals equity value. So like where and how do you have these conversations with your clients about capital allocation? Because I think about whether to keep it in the family estate and have that as an asset versus like, take that asset and move it into the S&P 500 with bonds. And I say this because, and here's some context from my clients where like their asset that I'm helping them get unstuck. I mean, truly every one of the people that I'm working with, and there's 15 of them now, it's like, okay, we're trying to decouple our labor from the business by reinvesting into a CEO or somehow, building that cash flow. And then getting to the point where we've got that asset. But then therefore, if you look at their net worth pie chart, it's like 80% of it. So then like there still is a capital allocation decision that needs to be made going, what's the risk of this cash flow and this valuation? So we still need to know all of that stuff for capital allocation discussions. Where and how do you have those conversations? And maybe the family comes second, but like, is a question or my rambling make sense?
No, you're not rambling. No silver bullet. Wealth or life events typically help people focus on things that otherwise weren't a priority. If the average individual knew how much risk they were taking in their closely held operating business, being the only asset of significance for themselves and for their family, they'd shudder. They wouldn't sleep. But there's this sense that because they own it and they quote unquote can control it and their hard work can influence an outcome, that they have less risk than a diversified portfolio of, for example, the S&P 500. And just think about how silly that is. The S&P 500 represents the biggest companies in the United States and the biggest economy on the planet. These are the Super Bowl athletes of businesses. And to say that my small company is less risky than a portfolio of 300 of those, diversified in geographies and in industries, it doesn't make sense. But I understand the sensation. And so when I think about the average closely held business owner, and certainly for me, once again, size doesn't matter because we're wrestling with this no matter how big the size is. And for what it's worth, our average client's net worth is probably 80+% in their operating. It just happens to be
so it's the same. It's the same dynamics.
Same exact issue.
Yep.
And so then how do we think about the overall picture? Well, first of all, very few people even talk to them about the concept that their business is an asset and it has a place on the pie chart, right? The number of times I've been told by a business owner, I don't count my business because it's illiquid and, I can't sell it tomorrow anyway.
At your size of companies.
It's too numerous to count. And these are businesses that generate tons of revenue and tons and tons of income.
Why is this freaking industry of private equity rampant. It's like, I just like, even if we just take the concepts of like, hey, $1.5 trillion has been raised from all of the broke pension funds, endowments, and insurance companies to buy what you have. Maybe you have something that is valuable. Okay, before we keep going, like understand your risk. I'm tracking you. However, and maybe it's because your clients are so big where that if they diversified everything, if they hit the eject button, diversified everything, they probably have generational wealth. I don't know. I'm just assuming here.
I think that's fair.
Okay, so like then I've got here's my
Yeah.
thoughts. Is like I got so if my clients are doing like let's say it's $1 million to $2 million in normalized EBITDA, and they're trying to move to that point, there's not a lot of other vehicles where you can get that return. And I think about risk is like I hear you that there's a lot of risk, but like you know what do you think about this? I had this guy Jason Weimer who's on my show. He told me he goes the way he thinks about risk is if I looked at and I can't remember if it's Simone from the gymnast doing the balance beam and then doing whatever freaking backflip and all that and landing. If she does that and lands at 99% of the time, I can't even stand on that thing. But so that's risky, but there's that control that allows her to hit that percentage of a time. So like, what are your thoughts about risk and how, like, sorry, it's my diversion.
No, I think it's a really interesting concept. So first, we've never met a family that got super wealthy because they dollar cost average in the S&P 500. It doesn't happen.
Right.
Wealth is created by concentrating risk. Wealth is created oftentimes by the use of leverage. And wealth is created having an emotional response to risk that doesn't make sense on paper. Now, that doesn't mean that risk is static. You can take a really high risk business, which any single investment, any single line item on your balance sheet is high risk, and you can make it less risky. And there are very few places where you can also make something less risky while increasing its value at the same time. Traditionally, you would expect for us to sell our business and invest in the S&P 500 and earn a lower expected return over time because it's a lower risk investment. In the private business space, by truly treating it like an asset, by professionalizing, you can reduce its risk. It's still relatively risky compared to the S&P 500, but you can radically reduce the risk of that business and you can increase the expected returns on part time, equity cash flow or equity value. And so it's one of those things where you kind of get to have a free lunch if you're willing to do the hard work.
Yep.
And it's only after you've concentrated risk and bet on yourself for a long time and you ground through the difficult times and you signed the personal guarantees and you came out on the side that you have the ability to have generational. You don't build generational wealth by buying S&P 500, $100 a week and dollar cost averaging. You can create a nice nest egg. You create financial security for yourself, but you don't create generational wealth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So where along the journey, going back to then like thinking about valuations, I think because this is one of the biggest, well, it's the biggest section of my workshop of like, just like, we have to understand how valuations work. You and I don't have to do that because I had Ken Sanginara recently, had a couple other valuation people on talk about, yeah, I mean like, and he's like, are you sure you want to geek out on weighted average cost of capital? I'm like, we got to go there, dude. But like, so, but understanding your client's perspective and how you help them or what is like, what is the importance of understanding valuations for your clients and how does that help them with decisions for capital allocation?
Yeah. So our families are subject to the estate tax. The estate tax today, any family with about $28 million of assets is going to have a 40% haircut on all of their hard work. And if you're a closely held business owner, ours are, and your net worth is illiquid, like ours are, then in order to come up with that estate tax, which is due in 270 days, it means we have to sell something of significance. And the Internal Revenue Service, they tell you what your company's worth, whether you like it or not. And so we can take an active role in trying to build a company that's as resilient as possible, it's as sellable as possible, and then plan for it during our life. Or the IRS uses something called the highest and best use standard. They take a handful of different valuation methodologies, with the objective being to come up with the largest defensible number possible. That's what they set their state tax. And the reality is that companies do have real value, whether or not you believe in it, Mr. Business Owner, and say, it's not liquid, I don't count it unless it's my bank account. And as a consequence, the IRS is going to put a big number on it. And if your company's not sellable, you're going to have to basically sell it for parts, or you're going to hope that your kids or your surviving spouse are able to go borrow a technical term shit ton of money from a bank to pay back the IRS. And if you're not lucky enough to do either of those, you can take out a really high interest loan from the IRS. And so for our families, we have to have an honest conversation about valuation, because we're going to have somebody else appraise that business at some point in the future. And look, we all exit our companies, right? I know the allergy to exit, but some of us do it horizontally. And if we leave it to the very end and we haven't done the hard work and haven't opened up the opportunity set for our family, we know what the outcome is going to be. And the reason why the estate tax is so insidious for closely held family businesses, not the actual amount of tax. I don't have a political position one way or another, but the fact that closely held businesses aren't liquid, and we're a mismatch in duration. We have a short-term obligation. We have a long-term asset. Means we have to go raise that cash some form of fashion. And so we have a reason to be talking about valuation that many other entrepreneurs don't. Now, that might change in a couple of years. The estate taxes, we're doing this right before the election, so who knows what the future holds. But the estate tax currently is scheduled to cut the exemption from 14 million per person, almost 28 million total, to 7 million per person, almost 14 million total. Still a big number, but if you're generating a couple $1 million of EBITDA and you got a nice house, and
that follows the inflation. You know, I mean, that like it's like literally counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Like,
well, and so Trump put the tax reform in that we're living in 2017, but there's a rule that says you can only put tax reform in for like 10 years without it paying for itself. So it has this automatic sunset that's built in. And just for those that say, hey, it's all going to get extended, I don't know. But what I do know is we were spending about $600 billion a year more than we took in 2017. We're spending 1.8 trillion a year more in our deficit. In 2017, when they put the new tax reform in place, they expected our federal debt to be 23 trillion. It's 35 trillion today. Directly go to 54 trillion over the next decade. I don't know what tax reform does in the future, but it's hard to believe it gets a lot better from here.
We're just in la la land. You're. I will refrain from going down the rabbit hole of everything you just like laid out in front of me, like this perfect juicy
softballs. But what I would challenge your entrepreneurs is you have to be aware that taxes are a driving function, and it's necessary, not sufficient, to be mindful of tax planning. Where a lot of families get stuck is they do a bunch of tax planning that's really rigid, and then they have to start making business decisions based on the tax plan. Just a quick sidebar. We had a client several years ago that came to us after transferring about 2/3 of their company to trust. Didn't really understand what that actually meant. Had an offer on the table, sell his company for about $100 million. And we got on a whiteboard and modeled out and said, hey, if you do this, your kids wind up with about $60 million. Net after tax, you wind up with about 15. And he said, well, that doesn't really work for my lifestyle. I said, but it's a fabulous estate tax plan, just a pretty terrible life plan.
Yeah.
And so he ended up
the tail wagging the dog
on that transaction. So don't put a really rigid structure in. But for the average entrepreneur who's got a couple $1 million of EBITDA, you might be ahead of that estate tax threshold in a couple of years. So you're going to have to be thinking about it in a way that you don't today. And people have to get real serious about valuation and have an honest and sober conversation, because the IRS will do it for you.
Yeah. And Roger Roundy, this tax mitigation specialist, I got to introduce you to, because it's some very interesting stuff he's doing for like income tax mitigation. That is pretty interesting. But going back to then like understanding valuation. So you're having conversations and then that's for the estate planning, but then I'm assuming, so is it fair to say that kind of triggers the conversations and the education? And then it's like, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Business Owner, now it's capital allocation. Like what should you be doing with this asset? And then how does that change the conversations for estate planning, keeping the family? Like, cause like at the end of the day, that's what we want to have conversations. Like, is this a good business or not? Right. From our capital.
Yeah. So estate planning valuations is a gateway drug to talking about the value of the company itself. We have this third party. It's going to value whether you like it or not. So we don't get a choice to not talk about valuation. So now we've all acknowledged we have this asset that's got value. How do we think about the value in terms of increasing the value for our family, decreasing the value for estate taxes, trying to do those things simultaneously? And then how do we own it in the optimal place so that no matter what the outcome is, death, disability, sale, transfer, that we have the least headwinds possible. Right? And we're
Got it.
trying to juggle
And
all
in
of
the
those
optimist
things.
place, is that like trust or something with some sort of,
Yeah, in
estate
the
planning?
estate, out of the estate.
Got
I
it.
mean,
Yeah.
some people get really creative with the whole host of different trusts, depending on the state that you live in. It might not even be for estate tax purposes. It might be for, income tax, state, local income tax purposes. Do I own my California company in California, or do I own it in a trust in another state?
Yep. Yep.
That type of planning is all available for conversation, but you have to be talking about valuation in order for that planning to work. And the other thing we have to be talking about as a kind of a lead in there is, if we're going to talk about ownership, it's one thing for you to say, hey, I've eaten shit for the last 30 years. I've grit my way through this. And that's what made the company successful. Fantastic. What's the future mean for your family? It's this cruel irony that the things that make for the very best tax plans also at times require joint ownership and joint decision making. And ask almost any one of your clients if they would have been as successful if they had to make every decision with their brother or their sister, and they will almost all say no. And what a lot of this planning requires that. And so we're now talking about what it means to be a good owner, right? Or is the ownership going to be your kids equally? What are the expectations around that? What are the opportunities around that? What are the responsibilities around that? Is it going to be sell it to the management team? What do we expect them to do?
And that's ownership decisions. Cause like, how many of your clients on the family side do a good job at bifurcating like family governance, family estate, generate family wealth, and then have a clear distinction of like, what are the expectations, whether someone needs to work here or not?
Very rarely are they doing it unless somebody's pushing them off. It's some of the most uncomfortable conversations that people can have, because family businesses ultimately have a legacy aspect that you can't put in an Excel spreadsheet. Right? Legacy doesn't fit into WAP. And as a consequence, people are making emotional decisions for a financial asset. And so trying to disentangle what it means for family to share ownership and for family to share decision-making responsibility oftentimes devolves into feelings and not the same blue flame thinking that people would make around a black and white Excel spreadsheet, if you will. And it's really challenging, and it sets the course of the business. I mean, more than one family I can think of who has transferred their company to the family broadly. Some family members are involved. Some members are not involved. Company hits an inflection point. It's a grow and die or die scenario. They got to go take out a new credit facility. Somebody's got to post collateral. And one of the family members said, I'm not involved. I refuse to sign to PG, or I refuse to provide any more collateral. I refuse to shut my distributions down. And the company goes into structural decline. And the inverse is true, right? Somebody who just wants to grow for the sake of growth. And now literally people are having a food fight at Thanksgiving because there's just
what it does,
disagreement.
no, I'm tracking you, dude. And it literally is, it's going right into my thesis, which is like, I just don't think it's any more complicated than if you and I own an asset together, we have to put our jobs over here. We have to do that. And then we have to say, okay, as an owner of this asset, what is our expectations for income through distributions and our equity valuation and our timeline? If you and I do not have that conversation, it could be partners, it could be, PE firm combined with an ESOP. It could be like, it doesn't really matter what the ownership is. It's distributions versus reinvestment and equity valuation target and the timeline, because you could literally reverse engineer the 3-statement model. And like, if the only thing that I see, and my God, Pat Hobby just like tainted my wordly, because it's like, it is a spreadsheet and a column. However, then it's like having those conversations and communications, like what happens if we hit a bump in the road? What happens if, and that's what these are the conversations that should be had at the quarterly meetings and the annual meetings, saying like, are we on track or off track? And like, how does that impact? Like, one of my clients had a bunch of shit go down, and like, he's like, I don't want them to hit the easy button, which is take out my distributions because I need it for my lifestyle right now. Then it's like, okay, well, then we have to shrink the asset. I mean, like, but like, we're at least bifurcating these conversations. Another one of my clients, he's like, well, we might be able to put the company, because they kick out a bunch of money. And it's like, we can put this company into the family estate and grow the family estate. And he goes, well, what about, and let's call his kid Joe. Well, I want to have opportunities for Joe. I'm like, dude, why does Joe have to work at your business? And like, but he's like, oh, I didn't even think about that. I'm like, opportunities might be go outside of this. And there's this weird, like, you just need to eat shit like I did. And like, I still think people should go through hard work to figure out who they should be. But like, I don't know, man. Like, they say
experience is what you get when you don't get what you want. And so all of these entrepreneurs have got tons of scar tissue built up around the really hard times in the beginning. But to a large degree, they systematically try to inoculate their children from having those same experiences, but they still want them to have the same risk profile, risk tolerance, grit, the ability to size up an opportunity, but they've never had to have those same experiences. And
So true.
it's a really weird kind of juxtaposition. But what I would say is when we think about like where did this company ultimately get owned? We had a client just recently where we really challenged this notion that we should have a board meeting. Board meetings can be a useful tool, but ultimately, what is a board responsible for? Board is responsible to an owner. The owner's the one that sets the mandate. Owner's one says grow like crazy or shut this thing down. Owner's one says spin out a bunch of cash flow. Owner says how much risk I'm willing to take. And so for this family, we put the board meetings on ice and we spent about a year having ownership meetings. Nothing to do with the operations of the business, more about what the family wanted the business to be.
Right.
And as a consequence, when we reconstituted the board, two things jumped out of us. One, we were running the business in a very different way a year later, not because we had made business decisions specifically, but we made decisions around what the owner mandate is. But two of the six shareholders decided to exit the business. And it removed a huge amount of friction internally because the remaining shareholders decided they wanted to grow the company like crazy. And they literally stacked hands and said, we're not going to make a single distribution for the next 5 years beyond taxes. And they said, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's the equity value we're trying to accomplish.
Sweet.
Here's what we're tying our incentive compensation plans for our management team to. And two of the shareholders, credit, stood up and said, guys, that is a fit with my lifestyle. And I'm not signed up for that level of risk. And I'm not signed up for that type of a business. And so as a consequence, we worked on for about 6 months of redemption. There was a lot of feelings because this is a legacy business. And now I literally talked to them yesterday over the weekend, and they're making plans for Thanksgiving.
That's awesome.
And that only worked because we really took it down to the studs as it relates to ownership. And this is a business that's been around for a long time and has a great brand and reputation.
Well, it's so encouraging, Brandon, because like that, I mean, that's like literally what the framework is that I'm working on with these smaller companies and you're working on. And like, I agree with you. It's not about the board and the operations. It's like, what do you want? And it sounds so ridiculous. And going back to like our constraints, right? As we're kind of sliding into home for this conversation, we could always do it again, but like, it's like, you can't run fast unless you know where the hell you're running. And and that's always been so fundamental to me because I just want to wake up and I just want my energy. I want it to funnel in the right direction. I don't want to have to be anxious of whether it's in the right direction or not. And that's what I heard you when you say bring it down to the studs. It's like, what do we want? And how great that there was a conversation that someone says, well, I'm not aligned with this. Instead of like what I see is like that bubbles up in every weekly meeting or every monthly meeting. And that conflict is unresolved because at the end of the day, it's all about time, cash flow, or wealth and just unsaid. And so then there's the tit for tat resentment.
Well, I'm filing down the edges a little bit. The other part of that story is I would love to say that I was so clairvoyant that we needed to take it down to these ownership conversations that I did it proactively, but we were reacting to a board meeting where two of the five senior most non-family members said, we will not come to another board meeting and present if these family members are there for the couple because the family is so out of whack and their behavior is not becoming. And so we really had this big business, but we had this existential crisis where we actually had to like do the hard work and have some really, really challenging conversation. But what was interesting about that process is if everybody is really honest about what they want, the outliers are, I mean, they stick out like a sore thumb and it's not bad. They just wanted a different thing. And so we have a choice. And the conversation with those guys is, okay, we have two divergent paths and we cannot find a middle ground here. Do you believe in your path strong enough to buy this business from the others? And the answer was no.
And have to have an agreement on the valuation. Right. So all this stuff and that's why it's interesting. Step number 2 of my material of my framework is choose the game. It's like the outliers aren't bad, like you said. It's just you're choosing a different ownership game of what you want for cash flow and equity and where you want your risk to be. And we're just like deliberately hitching our wagon with something instead of just guessing, dude. Like it's fun, man. I know you got to get going for a meeting here. Anything that we didn't cover or like, I'm given the fact that we got 5-10 minutes left. I don't know if there's anything.
Well, I think starting with the end in mind, from the standpoint of you're working with entrepreneurs that have built nice businesses, they aspire to grow bigger businesses. And I think there's immense value learning from people who are further along in the same journey because they're all trying to go to the same place. Right? It's a form of time travel to be able to learn from others further ahead and find out where the hazards are marked, because for the most part, they are. The couple of things that I would leave your audience with that companies who are bigger than the ones that you're primarily working with today wrestle with. A, you're not unique in the best way possible, right? So it's not as if somebody else has got it all figured out and you trip over the next EBITDA or net income or revenue hurdle, and all of a sudden this has all been revealed to you. Second, the sooner you get serious about this, which I would challenge in many respects, the cohort that you're working with is way further ahead than many of the families we work with taking this seriously. The not only more dividends it will pay literally, but the family dynamics and the cognitive fatigue go down immensely. And it's just way easier to deal with when your company's worth $5 or $10 million versus when your company's worth 50 or 100 or 500 million. The knock-on effect for the stakeholders, just it's smaller. And so it is wonderful to focus on it. And then really the last thing is, if we all have the same types of goals and nobody has really got this figured out, and if you look around at your contemporaries and they're wrestling with the same things that you are, doing the same things that they're doing and they have always done probably is not going to get you a different result. And it's
Amen.
when I think about, for example, the tax planning, and I think about the allergic reaction that families have to the invoice that the CPA sends. I don't love writing a big check for my tax return. But if I don't believe that my CPA can add value, probably got the wrong CPA. And if I don't believe that my estate planning attorney or my corporate attorney, I can't give him the information that he needs to add value, he can't save me or protect me, that extra hour at $600 or $900 or $1,000, I probably got the wrong team. And if you're doing it yourself, trying to manage all of these people, you're probably doing $20 an hour work, not $1,000 an hour work. And that's where people really get stuck. They get overwhelmed by the perception of complexity. And as a consequence, they choose not to act, or I'm going to get it over with. And they make irrevocable decisions they don't realize are irrevocable. And that rigidity sets them way back. Because as an entrepreneur, you can't make a family plan without affecting your business. You can't make a business plan without affecting your taxes. And people treat these as separate and unique things. And they're not. They are all this intertwined, interconnected. It's a balloon animal. You squeeze one side, the other side gets larger. And you don't have an estate plan. You don't have a retirement plan. You just have life. You have the plan. And all these things are inputs. And when people taking them as individual pieces, they end up getting high centered on a regular basis.
Well, and I think what very well said is succinctly putting this all together. And I think one thing, Brandon, I'll have to at some point show you this picture where we have the pie chart of net worth, and then we have this thing that kicks out income. And that's what I mean. And then there's time. And like, that's why I keep going back to that, because your pie chart of your net worth is all those assets. And then you have your income, and there's just these trade-offs. And the thing that I find way more difficult for people in my part of the marketplace is they don't have the cash flow to hire the good people. And that's the problem, is like they have to be their own general contractor, because, there's a couple of people, shout out to like this North Rock Partners and some other people who like actually have come up with like a family office structure for illiquid entrepreneurs in the middle market. But like they're getting just it's just rough, dude. Like getting good advice from all of the different professionals, and they don't even know how to judge what good looks like. So it's but yes, I mean, like they should hire it out. It's just difficult.
Well, but even if they're running point, and we use the analogy of a general contractor as well. These are important decisions that have a real impact, not just on the business today, but the family long term. And so throwing your hands up out of frustration and saying anybody will do, and providing your team the bare minimum information necessary to accomplish this narrow and unique task is setting somebody up for a disappointing experience. And so what would you expect a general contractor to do? You wouldn't expect the general contractor. Well, you wouldn't expect the general contractor to call the electrician and say, I need one outlet, install that one outlet, and then leave.
Well, I think it's even, that because I've been using the general contractor for the years too, Brandon. And you know what it is? because I joke around because I was in this situation with my dad. It's like I like the as an owner, if we don't get our shit together, know what we want, why we want it, how this stuff works, and actually understand how all the players are in an actually cohesive way, it's what we do to these advisors is it's like calling a travel agent, refusing to tell them where we want to go, and then holding our expectations on them. It's just like, of course it's not going to work because like we're all just throwing shit against the wall. And like, yeah, it's
Well, and I think
pretty dysfunctional.
the personal accountability is that whoever your general contractor is, whether you're doing it yourself or somebody else, the responsibility is to know what you own, to know why you own it, to know where you own it, and to be communicative to those other professionals and not be, to your point, yeah, I want to go on a trip. Where do you want to go? I want to go to Europe. Anywhere in Europe works? No, of course not. Do I have to guess where in Europe you'd like to go? That's a real challenge. But even if you knew exactly which city in Italy you wanted to attend, if I don't know where you're taking off from, hard for me to book your flights. Right? And so many people will say, I've got my true north figured out, and they have no clue where they're at today, that the plan goes into some sort of like catastrophic failure because they haven't gotten that first waypoint on the GPS.
Yeah, and the expectations are misaligned. So then therefore like, and so as kind of a final wrap up, because like I'm truly trying to calibrate what I've been working on with my clients, see if it's making sense. Because you've been watching this for almost a decade now. Where like if someone came to you and said, all right, Brandon, like here's the income that I need through distributions. Here's the company. Here's the equity valuation that we want at the company at a point in time. I just have this belief that it's like, okay, especially if we have a 3-statement model where we can clearly see how the strategies of the company all layer into that. So it's not just guesswork. And then you zoom out and you have, it's like, you zoom out and then you can see all the advisors of the banking, the tax, the wealth, the finance, and say, okay, how are we all going to accomplish this? It becomes so much easier. Like if someone came to you and said that, like how much easier would it be to manage the whole situation? Like you get to work instead of dealing with all the other shit, I would assume.
Yeah, I mean, not to be too silly about it, but they wouldn't need us, right? I mean, if somebody had that level of clarity and they could really come and say, here's where I'm at, here's where I'm attempting to go, here's the team I built and why I built them, here's the information that's been shared with them, here are the accountability metrics and frameworks that have been put in place. All you have to do is tweak around the margins. Yeah, I mean, the work that we do and people like us do goes from a level, 8 or 9 complexity to a level 1 or 2 complexity. And it's just execution risk at that point.
But back to buying back time though, I still would argue that your time, like, let me put it this way. If I had enough wealth to still be able to hire you and pay your fee to be able to be working at that next level while it's more capital allocation and moving to freedom of time and moving money around, that's more enjoyable anyways, instead of you being, stuck in the weeds arguing with attorneys and, and accountants.
Yeah, I mean, look,
stuff like that.
there's plenty of minutia required to design, implement, and maintain these living, breathing, complex, organism that is the family plan. But to your point, if somebody came with that level of clarity, what we would get done in a year would oftentimes be, reflective of what we would get done in 5 years. And they would save money, they'd save time, the impact would be bigger, it'd be quicker. Everybody have a lot more fun along the way.
Fun, man. It's what it's all about. I enjoyed catching up. It's been way too long. We got to hit the mountain. What else? Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm all over LinkedIn, Brandon Henry, and my firm is Mosaic, and so they can check us out on the website. It's word salad. We have not figured out a way to distill what we do, and something.
You have a lot of certifications. You are smart, and
I have crushing insecurity, which is I'm trying to distract.
Have you nailed the alphabet? You actually have? You got every word or every?
I don't think I've got any Z. I don't have any Z's yet, man. I have to make something up.
Hey, I'll come up with a certification. I can guarantee I'll get you that Z.
Yeah, fair enough.
Dude, it's so fun. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah.
Thanks for having me. Bye now.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Brandon. I think it's really helpful to know that not everybody's got it figured out. Even if they've got a bunch of commas that we don't have, people still need to think the same way, which is they need to think about the difference between their ownership roles and their operating roles What do they want for their asset from cash flow and equity long term? What are the trade-offs between reinvesting and distributions based on the return? And then what's the goal? And having a lot of those conversations is just really important. So the work that you're doing by listening in and the discipline that you're putting into place puts you in such a unique category, and it breeds success over the long period of time. Doesn't mean it's not hard, but it increases the odds that you will be successful and you will have the independence that you deserve. And if you enjoy this episode, please share it with other people. Please give it a rating on Apple or Spotify. It helps get additional guests and it helps build the brand reputation of the show. Thanks, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you next week.